The next presenter will be Mary Kay Magistad. You have her bio as well. Mary Kay brings an extraordinary set of experiences and long history in China. As a journalist, you've probably heard her on NPR and American Public Radio? PRI, The World, yeah. 88.5, you've probably heard her. KQED is where I've normally heard her reports. We've been on some panels before, and she just has an extraordinary amount of information to share with us. So please welcome Mary Kay Magistad.
It's really an honor to speak to teachers about something that I've been passionate about and deeply involved in for much of my adult life. I lived in Beijing for 15 years, and I love Beijing. It's one of my favorite cities in the world because it's incredibly dynamic. It always surprises you. It reminds me every day when I'm there that China is not monolithic. The government's not monolithic. The population's not monolithic. Within one block, you could see something like this. This is in the neighborhood that I lived in for a decade, Sanlitun, which is a diplomatic area, but it also has, there are a lot of foreigners who come and go there. There are a lot of little Chinese neighborhoods that are very traditional Beijing neighborhoods. I like this picture because this is the embassy guard who are changing, as they do every couple of hours, walking in front of a sign that says patriotism, innovation, inclusiveness, virtue. And of course, this is one of the tensions in China today, is that you have the traditional approach to power coming from the government, and then you have a call for innovation, a call for people to open their minds, think differently, think creatively. Interestingly is happening, but not necessarily happening because the government is calling for it and encouraging it. So in my neighborhood, you can see scenes like this, middle-class Chinese with their mobile phones and whatever else, going to shopping malls. Occasionally quirky little scenes like this, upper middle-class Chinese shopping in designer stores where you have this goofy set of sculptures of men with little guns pointing at them. And then you could, oh, sorry, let me go back. And then you could see things like this. I took this picture 5 minutes after the soldiers walked by. In Beijing, in Shanghai, in many major Chinese cities, they're literally built by migrants. And in Beijing and Shanghai, 45% of the migrants do not have resident permits. They don't have, basically they're not recognized as citizens of the city. They don't have access, their kids don't have access to schools to be able to go all the way through to high school. They have to go back to their villages to finish high school, where they have to take their college entrance exam. It's often more difficult. They have to get a higher score to get into the same universities in the big cities. And in fact, as China's income disparity has grown in the past decade or so, it's now one of the highest in the world, according to China's Southwestern University, a study that was done there about 2-3 years ago. It's 0.61, with 1 being absolute disparity and 0 being absolute equality. It's higher than in the US. And it's not just in the cities that migrants and people who are sort of on the lower rungs of society economically have issues. It's also in the countryside where almost half the Chinese population still lives, and where water resources can be limited and roads bad. This particular village is in Ningxia province, which is 2 provinces west of Beijing. I went there the first time in 1997 when they first got electricity, and then went back a decade later to see how they were doing. And they were doing about the same. They had sent a lot of their young people to cities to get jobs and send money back home. But the local government had decided that this village wasn't really worth investing in. This, I have to say, is an exception, because in a lot of rural China, there's been extraordinary development and extraordinary opportunities for a lot of people. But it is also true that in much of rural China, the way that you get ahead is to go to the cities. So you have, this is a typical rural school house. And these kids, their future lies in going elsewhere. what's working to their benefit is that at least within the cities, as more people mix, as more young Chinese find that there are these disparities, there are these challenges facing society, that there's something, perhaps that they want to do about it. I think the one-child generation gets a bad rap. I actually did a series on them back in 2007 and have been following since what I think is a really interesting engagement with society by many of them. An interest in volunteering, in environmental NGOs, going out to rural schools and helping to teach, at least for short periods of time. I also will say that about the younger generation in China that it's sophisticated, it's plugged in to the modern world. It's very much at a level where, and by this I'm meaning, again, urban youth. Although even in the countryside, most Chinese are online. Most Chinese access the internet through their smartphones. And there's been this interesting acceleration as people have had access to more and more information, to more and more ideas being shared. What often happens in a society as it develops economically and becomes more sophisticated as it urbanizes is that there is a movement toward civil society. What do we mean by civil society? Hang on one second. And why does it matter in modern China? Well, I would say that you could use the dictionary definition. It's a community of citizens linked by common interests and collective action. It's a public space beyond the government, the family, and the market in which people can debate and take action. My personal definition as well is a sense of shared responsibility and stewardship for a way of life people value. So it's being not a subject, but a citizen. It's considering that you can have an impact, that your voice matters, that your opinion matters, that you deserve respect, that you deserve dignity, that it isn't just a hierarchical relationship that you have with the government where you need to obey. And it can include all of these things. Debate, sharing of information and ideas, discussing shared concerns in person in the news media or on the internet and social media, all of which have been happening in incredible ways in China, particularly over the last few years since Weibo came into the fore in 2009. There have been considerable efforts in the last couple of years to try to curb the influence of the internet in China. And I'm not going to go into that too much because David will, but just to touch on it, it was extraordinary for me to be living in China and watching this acceleration. Once millions of Chinese could share ideas in real time, could affect change in real time. Citizens or Chinese people could point out, hey, this government official is behaving badly. Hey, there's this unusual pollution here, what can we do about it? Hey, there's this land grab going on and there's a protest here and if you want to check it out, go. This could be seen by different governments in different ways. It could be seen as a check and balance. It could be seen as a way of alerting the government that these are things that people are concerned about. And to some extent, the Chinese government, I would say in the 2000s, took that approach to some extent. The internet was a good thing because it allowed more visibility into what people were thinking about, what they cared about, and the government could be responsive and be seen to be responsive. And I think a lot of people looked at that dynamic at the time and thought, wow, that's interesting. Maybe we're moving on to something. Maybe we're moving on to a different kind of relationship between the government and the people of China. I had a conversation with a young Chinese person, 21, 22, where I remember mentioning something about citizens in China, and he stopped me and he said, we're not citizens, we're subjects. Which I found really interesting. This was maybe 2010, so it was very soon after Weibo got going. And I thought it was interesting that someone this young knew the difference between citizen and subject, was expressing discontent that the situation he felt was one way and not the other, but also that he seemed to think that there was a possibility for some kind of change. Now, obviously, in China's history, the Chinese government has had a long and complicated relationship with those that it rules. And when Confucius was advocating a certain kind of responsible leadership in 500 BC, even he had a hard time initially getting the ear of the emperor. I mean, eventually emperors started listening and taking on his philosophy, but even his philosophy, which encouraged responsibility to society, still talked about a vertical relationship. Vertical relationships in the family, vertical relationships between ordinary people and those who were governing or ruling. There certainly were some aspects of Chinese society even back then, and that Confucius advocated, that had some overlap with civil society, a sense of responsibility, but the responsibility tended to be in these concentric circles. There's responsibility to your family, to your clan, to your village. The leap to thinking about, I'm part of a bigger society, I'm a citizen in a bigger society, so even people I don't know matter. It matters to work for the greater good of all society. Was not as universally embraced. So 500 years later, when these guys were carved, the emperor certainly didn't suffer criticism gladly. This was Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, and he ordered books to be burned that he felt were in conflict with his own ideas. He was said to have buried alive hundreds of intellectuals who offered alternative views to his own. The same emperor built the first version of the Great Wall as a line of defense and a way of keeping out challenges. And so it went for a couple thousand years that emperors were to greater or lesser extents benevolent or dictatorial, and then we got to the May 4th movement, which we've heard about from Tom, where Chinese citizens began to test out what it meant to be citizens and not subjects. And as we've heard, the 1920s and 30s were a really interesting time, not just in Beijing, but also in Shanghai, where journalists and filmmakers and academics, and then just people on the street, were beginning to express ideas and desires that were different from those in power. One of the people who basically was a newspaper clipper at Beijing University when these protests happened said that this was indeed an inspiration for the Communist Party and basically the ideals behind the Communist Party when it eventually took over in China. And he should know because he helped bring it to power. On the path to power, Mao promised the poor and disenfranchised that he would champion them and give them a better life. And some of that did come to pass. The life expectancy in China went up. Poor farmers and uneducated workers found themselves with considerably more of a voice than they'd had relative to the educated elite. But the educated elite were repeatedly purged by Mao, often violently. One of the people who was purged more than once, 3 times in fact, was Deng Xiaoping, who followed Mao. He'd actually helped Mao carry out the anti-intellectual purge in the 1950s. But he'd also been, but he basically, when he came to power, wanted to take the country in a different direction. So thus began the era of reform and opening up in 1979. The party's control started to ease. The party started to back out of people's personal lives. One of the interesting, sort of landmark moments at the very early stage of reform and opening up was in 1979 when something called the democracy wall started. So ordinary people started posting characters, posting ideas on the wall. One person who posted something was called Wei Jingsheng, who said that China should not only have the modernizations that Deng was calling for, economic reform chief among them, but should also have democracy. He was calling for the same thing that the students in the May 4th movement had called for, Mr. Democracy, not just Mr. Science. For his troubles, he got 15 years in prison. But Deng wasn't entirely opposed to democracy. In 1987, he allowed village elections to start. These were not considered a direct threat to the line of the hierarchy of power in the Communist Party because this was just for local leaders. They wouldn't be able to ascend to the National People's Congress. Nonetheless, it would allow villagers to feel that they had some say in figuring out who was going to help them solve local problems. And Deng himself said at the time that he could foresee national democracy within 50 years, something that the current leader, Xi Jinping, has said is absolutely inappropriate for China. So early in the reform and opening up process, there was also room that was opened for social organizations. But there was wariness about this. So the early regulation was that a social organization or an NGO needed to be associated with a government agency and then overseen on top of that by the State Commission for the Restructuring of the Economic System. Still, as Tom talked about, in the 80s, as in the early 1920s, there was this period of exploration of ideas. Who can we learn from? What is China going to become? Who are we as a population? Who are we as citizens? And it, of course, culminated in the Tiananmen protests. Oops, sorry. After the tanks rolled out and hundreds of people had been killed, a chill descended, and the Communist Party was left to think, okay, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And it wasn't just defensive. It was also, okay, clearly we weren't being responsive enough, so we need to do something differently. But to be defensive just for a moment, let's make sure that young Chinese learn to be patriotic. So the Patriotic Education curriculum was started in Chinese schools in the early 90s, stressing that China had suffered a century of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers in a way that hadn't been stressed quite so much before. And lest young students not get the message when they were first in school, students going into universities were required to do military training for a couple of weeks before they actually started school. So they would develop an appreciation for what the People's Liberation Army did for them and would at least feel a little closer to them so that they wouldn't feel that they were the enemy. In the 1990s, the government also started to, again, step back. The tacit agreement, which has been said many times by many people, was don't challenge us directly, don't challenge our right to rule, and we'll give you space. We'll let you make money, we'll let you live a pretty good life. And some interesting things happened in the 90s. China began to embrace the internet. I was at the National People's Congress in 1996 when there was a press conference about, okay, we're opening up to the internet. And I actually asked, are you concerned that this could, bring in information that, you're not entirely comfortable with the population having access to? And the official who was giving the press conference said, we actually think the internet will do far more good than harm in China. We're willing to take that risk. Also, going into the late 90s and early 2000s, China's state-run media started having to compete. They started having to compete with each other. Market reforms required them to actually make their own money and become profitable. So the journalists from these state-run organizations started becoming more aggressive and seeking out actual stories and thinking, what do people want to hear about? What do they want to read about? And some of them actually began to do really serious, good investigative reporting, and that increased over time to the point that you'd have journalists who were banned within their own province from reporting on particular critical stories. So they'd go to the next province that had a very similar problem and report there. Eventually that was banned too. But it was interesting, the creativity that was shown and the desire that was shown by many of these journalists to try to get out into the public some of these issues that people had been living with, to make it part of the public conversation, which I would argue is part of building a civil society, whether they intended that consciously or not. Also in the 90s, foreign foundations and NGOs were doing training for, with lawyers and judges to try to improve rule of law, to try to have there be an avenue for people who had a grievance to get recourse so that you wouldn't have to take to the streets and protest. And also in the 90s, this guy, Liang Zongjie, started China's first NGO, first environmental NGO. That was in 1994. Now there are about 500,000 NGOs and social organizations in China, and the government welcomes many of them, actually, especially those that provide social services or community centers for the elderly and disabled. What it's uncomfortable with is organizations that help in labor disputes, that have any sort of political tinge, that help people who have grievances related to their land being grabbed by local governments and sold to developers. Because these are the subjects around which people have been protesting the most. I just got a 3-minute warning, so I'm going to speed through the rest of what I was going to say, which is there have been a lot of reasons to protest in China over the course of the last 10, 15 years, and the number of protests has gone up exponentially from a few thousand in the 90s to tens of thousands. The last time police reports were made public or that any credible estimate was given, it was in 2010, and it was more than 160,000 protests. So this begs the question of, at this point, the government has shown over the last couple of years that it's less comfortable with having a vocal civil society. It's less comfortable with having journalists challenging corrupt officials, with criticism online, with people taking to the streets. And right up to what we had been seeing in media reports over the last month, where China's civil rights lawyers, who basically had the mission of making sure that the Constitution of China was upheld in courts, that the rights and regulations of the Constitution were upheld. Many of them, 190 of them, or of their aides, have been detained and questioned, and some of them face criminal prosecution. Because the current government has said that it sees certain undesirable Western influences that are creeping into Chinese citizens or Chinese people's perceptions of what might be a good thing for China to pursue. And among these evils are democracy, civil society, constitutionalism, which is following your own constitution, and rule of law. So there's this tension now, which I referred to at the beginning of the talk, which I think is only getting greater, where you have a society that is increasingly aware of what its rights could be, should be, how citizens and governments interact with each other elsewhere. As Tom said, they look to Taiwan, they look to Korea, they see that societies that have had similar Confucian background can do this, can embrace civil society, and that it only helps make the entire society stronger. They can even look to India and see that a large country is capable of doing this without everything becoming chaotic. So I think this will continue to be an interesting and important tension to watch for those of us who are interested in China, because I think it will be a fundamental part of shaping China's future. Thank you.